Hello everyone. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. We are nearing the final in a series of 25 work health and safety webinars and in-person presentations being provided by the Department of Mines, Industry Regulation and Safety. The final webinar will be on 4 February and focus on work health and safety, asbestos and demolition licensing regulations. My name is Bill Mitchell. My colleagues presenting today include Eric Parsonage, an engineer from the WorkSafe plant team, Zarina Detonac and Lucy Peckham from the DEMERS licensing branch, responsible for processing authorisations such as high-risk work licences, asbestos and demolition licences under both the OSH laws and the work health and safety laws. I would like to commence this webinar with an acknowledgement to country. The Department of Mines, Industry Regulation and Safety acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of this land on which we deliver our services. We pay our respects to elders and leaders past, present and emerging. After the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of WorkSafe officers. To ask a question, go to slido.com and use the code #WHS5. We obviously encourage you to ask questions as this opportunity has been provided to you. This slide will be provided again at the end of the presentation if you miss the details now. As I mentioned, DEMERS is conducting 25 webinars and seminars to provide information about the work health and safety laws and work health and safety regulations in particular. The government has provided the exposure drafts of the work health and safety regulations in order that workplace participants can prepare for the commencement of the work health and safety laws. The focus of today's webinar is on plant registration and high-risk work licences. If you require general information about the work health and safety regulations, it is expected that the previous presentation on the work health and safety regulations will be available on the DEMERS website by the end of the week. There are 3 phases to our presentation today. Eric will provide information about plant registrations. Zarina and Lucy will present information about high-risk work licences. Once these 2 presentations are complete, there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions through Slido. The remainder of the hour will be available for you to ask questions and for the DEMERS officers to respond once they've finished their presentation. Here is our first speaker, Eric Parsonage, who will talk about plant registration.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you all for joining this presentation. I will be covering primarily and purely the plant and design registration aspects of the new legislation in context of how they are going to differ from how our current legislation is applied. So for those of you who have been working with high-risk plant, then you'll know that certain types of plant, including things like lifts and pressure vessels and cranes of certain types, all require design or plant registration or both. As part of our efforts to harmonise with the broader regulations that are in place around the country, we have adopted a number of regulations that are essentially the same as those in other jurisdictions. So the WHS General Regulations of 2022 will have the same numbering format as other regulations do in different states. So if you look under Chapter 5 in the exposure draft, you'll find the details of how you are meant to comply with the requirements for design registration and plant registration for your items of plant. What is new in plant registration? So firstly, in plant registration specifically, so this is the registration that needs to cover individual items of plant that present a high risk, we will differ from other states in not having renewal registration. So if you were to register an item of plant in, say, New South Wales or Queensland, then you would need to re-register it every 5 years freshly and pay again and again to be able to re-register it. However, that's not going to be adopted in the Western Australian legislation. A registration of plant is going to be a registration for life. And that also applies to change of ownership. So where previously you had bought and sold an item of plant, it needed to be individually registered again with the new owner's details. Now that is purely going to be a change of information, and the cost of the initial registration is going to cover the plant for its entire lifetime. Now, what differs in the new legislation, particularly under Regulation 262, is that a person with management or control of an item of plant may apply to the regulator for the registration of that item of plant. So previously it had to be the owner or operator, but this means that any person with management or control, so if you are renting an item of plant or if you are providing it as part of a building, or if you are otherwise controlling it, then you can apply for registration just as much as the direct owner of it can, or the importer, or the various other duty holders that were covering it in the past. One of the significant differences is that stationary concrete placing booms will be added to the list of items of plant that require individual plant registration. So previously, these required neither design nor plant registration. They will now require both. So that's worth keeping in mind if you are a large construction operator or you rent out these items of plant. In design registration, there are somewhat more changes than those in just plant registration. So firstly, there is who can apply to register an individual plant design. So plant design can be registered in Western Australia only if there is a reason for it to be registered in Western Australia. So for example, the item of plant is only going to be used in Western Australia, or the manufacturer is based in Western Australia. And it must be registered by a Western Australian resident or a business that has a presence within Western Australia under the new legislation. The person who can actually apply for the design registration is the PCBU, who designs the item of plant, so the original designer, or also it can be a person with management control of an item of plant, and it's intended that that kind of terminology can cover people who have imported plant from overseas that has no local design registration, and they do require design registration. All designs must be registered and must be produced in accordance with published technical standards and engineering principles, which is a somewhat of a change with previous requirements. However, if you are following the previous requirements for design registration, then you should continue to be compliant with the new legislation. It should be noted again, and I'll probably say this several times, concrete placing booms, these are stationary concrete placing booms, do now require design registration. Mobile concrete placing booms, so truck-mounted concrete placing booms, now also require design registration when previously they only required plant registration. One of the other changes in design registration is who can be the design verifier. So under Regulation 252, there are now competency standards associated with being a design verifier. Previously, a design verifier could just be a competent person who has acquired through training, qualification, or experience the knowledge and skills to verify the design of the plant, but now it needs to be someone who has acquired that to inspect the plant and is also eligible for professional engineer membership of Engineers Australia. So that's eligible. You don't explicitly have to be a member of Engineers Australia if you're going to be a design verifier, but you must meet all of the eligibility requirements. And you need to be able to demonstrate that in your design verification statement, or if you're asked otherwise by the inspector down the track. One of the other options is also that a person can be appointed or determined by the regulator to be a competent person, and that will potentially apply under different circumstances for unusual items of plant. If you are operating under the mine safety and inspection regulations, then you now need to meet the general regulations requirements for plant. So previously under the mine safety inspection regulations, certain items of plant, classified plant, required individual item registration with the Mine Safety Inspectorate. Now those will be registered with WorkSafe, and you will require both design registration and plant registration for items of plant that are listed in the design and plant registration requirement schedules. So it should be noted that if you have an item of plant that was previously not required to be individually registered under the general exemption of 2013, then you will need to register it as an individual item of plant. Now, don't panic. I know that you are now all very concerned about this. We will be in contact with each of the mine safety levy payers individually, and we will discuss how this is going to happen. There will be a transitional period, and we'll be able to work through this progressively. So just a broader comment, Section 42 of the WHS Act 2020 specifies the penalties associated with failing to meet the requirements of an authorization. So there are penalties associated with operating items of plant that haven't been registered. This is just to point out that it is a requirement under law, and it is a punishable offence if you fail to do so. And that's me. I'm happy to answer any questions about plant later on after our high-risk work license presenters have presented.
Good afternoon, my name is Zarina. Lucy and I will be interchanging between these slides, and I'll start with this first one. Just in relation to high-risk work licenses, the application process hasn't changed too much between the OSH regulations or the current legislation and the work health and safety regulations. The application form itself will change to accommodate the work health and safety regulations, and that application needs to be in the manner and form approved by the regulator, so it'll have a bit of a different design. Applicants will be required to evidence their age for each application, whether they're applying for a new license or adding a class. Applicants will be required to provide copies of their certification, which would be the statement of attainment and the notice of assessments that are completed by the WorkSafe registered assessors. And there will be requirements on applicants to complete declarations or a set of probity questions, which are prescribed by the work health and safety regulations. So that includes, does the applicant hold an equivalent license in another state? Has the applicant ever been convicted or found guilty of an offence under the Act? Have they entered into an enforceable undertaking, and have the licence that they've ever had been refused, conditioned, suspended, cancelled or disqualified? And then of course the application needs to be accompanied by the relevant fee.
Hello, my name is Lucy. I'll be telling you about what is coming for WHS. So we do have a new class of reach stacker. That's not required for 24 months, and there will be a new class which will be determined. We've got the new class of standard boiler, which is dropping down from 3 classes to 2. We've got the statement of experience and the notice of assessment, which is required within 60 days of the application. We've got that you may apply within 12 months of the expiry. So at the moment it's 24. We've got renew interstate license in WA, and that will be just on the relevant form. We've got the replacement license document, which you can apply for online, and we do have the new look card, which will be at the next issue.
So like Lucy was saying, we'll see a couple of new classes on commencement. So we have the reach stacker and the standard boiler class that will come in on commencement. So in relation to the reach stacker, there will be no requirement for a license to operate a reach stacker for 24 months to allow the high-risk work license industry to transition and obtain the class. With the standard boiler, basic boiler will be converted to standard boiler. Those who hold intermediate boiler will be converted to standard boiler as well, and those who hold an advanced boiler class on their high-risk work license will continue to hold an advanced boiler class. In terms of how to satisfy or I guess demonstrate the difference between the two standard boiler, like from the basic or the intermediate, it will be up to the employee and the employer to determine what type of boiler can be operated by the employee. So this relates specifically to those who previously held intermediate boiler on their high-risk work license, which may mean that the employer will need to be satisfied that the employee is or continues to be competent to operate intermediate boilers. Anyone who currently holds a high-risk work license for basic and intermediate will be issued a new card on commencement. And so that'll obviously be the plastic card, but a brand new one issued to you to reflect the changes. And high-risk work license holders in general will not receive any new cards reflecting the change of legislation until renewal. But there will be a notification received via email to all high-risk work license holders notifying them that obviously the legislation has changed, but that there are no other changes.
So for renewal of high-risk work licenses, not much has changed. Again, we have the 12 months instead of the 24. You can continue to renew online, and applicants who hold a high-risk work licence in a corresponding WHS state can now renew that licence in WA, and that again will be on the relevant form.
So high-risk work licence assessors, what is coming, OSH in comparison to work health and safety? So the main changes that you'll find if you are currently a registered assessor is that your name will change from being a registered assessor to an accredited assessor. This aligns with some of the other states in Australia that also have work health and safety legislation. So that'll be the main change for you. And of course, with assessors, there will be the additional classes for reach stackers and boilers as well. You won't receive any new cards, but you will receive a notification just advising you that the name of your registration has changed from registration to accreditation. And like with high-risk work license, those assessors who held basic boiler and basic intermediate will have their classes converted to standard boiler and receive a new card.
Thank you to our presenters. Just before we refer ourselves to answering questions, this is the way you can stay in touch with the department. So if you're not already, the department provides a subscriber list for newsletters, and we would encourage you to subscribe to that particular address. We're keeping people up to date with the developments in relation to the work health and safety laws through that subscriber list. So if you're not in already, please consider subscribing. The other option is the department has a website, a microsite in relation to the work health and safety laws, and that's the second address you can see on the screen. So that has all of the information available. It's obviously been updated extensively since September when it was launched, and it will continue to be updated as we move through towards the commencement and then after the commencement as well. For those involved in social media, there's some social media addresses there for you, and there's also an address there if you have any inquiries in relation to the work health and safety laws. The department, the government through the department is promoting the work health and safety laws extensively. The 25 seminars that we are providing are part of that process. The government has also provided significant funds to peak industry associations to also complement the activities of the department in terms of promoting the work health and safety laws. The peak bodies are the Master Builders WA, the HIA, the Housing Industry Association, the Chamber of Minerals and Energy, the Association of Mining and Exploration Companies, and the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Unions WA is also a peak body that has received substantial funding, and one of the conditions attached to that funding is that the promotional activities undertaken by those peak bodies is available generally to workplaces and not just restricted to their members. So we're about to go to the presentations now, the questions rather, as we have received a number of questions relating to issues not specific to the plant and high-risk work licence presentation we've done today. Our focus will be on plant and high-risk work questions, high-risk work licence questions. Time permitting, at the end of these questions, we will address any of the general questions that you may have. If we don't get to those, you're more than welcome to, as I mentioned earlier, review the general presentation that will be available on the Work Health and Safety on the DMIRS website towards the end of this week. And of course, you can send questions to the address that I have provided before. So before we start the questions, once again, I just remind you about Slido. So there's the address, and we can go straight to our questions now. So I'll ask the first question. Okay. If someone has a boiler intermediate, what classification will they move to when their registration is up for renewal, standard or advanced? So perhaps, Zarina, if I ask you, please.
Sorry, I just had to unmute my microphone. Like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, anyone that has an intermediate boiler will have their class immediately converted to standard boiler. You will receive a new card on commencement that will reflect that change. So it's not necessarily at renewal, but if you were to be looking at upgrading to advanced, that's a separate process.
Okay, the next question. Will WorkSafe be moving to online assessments? Zarina, sorry, yes, Zarina.
At this point in time, no. We're continually looking at different avenues that we can investigate and explore that. But for commencement with the work health and safety legislation, we won't be moving to online assessments.
So the next question, again, possibly for Zarina. Can a WorkSafe assessor assess boiler and turbine operations remotely, particularly when many power plants have been controlled in a centralised control room?
No, so they can't be carried out remotely. They need to be done in, much like all the other classes when they're being assessed. This was something that was explored during COVID, when obviously people couldn't go out to site and perform some of those assessments face to face, but it didn't work. We need to have people there to oversee all of the work throughout the entire assessment.
Can a WorkSafe assessor assess boiler and turbine operations remotely, particularly when many power plants have done this, haven't we? Sorry. Will current BI licence holders needing to upgrade to a BA have to undergo formal training and an advanced boiler high-risk work licence assessment? So in relation to that, if you have a basic boiler and an intermediate boiler, you'll be converted to a standard boiler class. If you want to obtain an advanced boiler class, you will need to undergo an assessment. So exactly the same as it is now. If you want to be an advanced boiler, you will need to obtain the statement of attainment and undergo the appropriate training. It's really up to you when you do that. The laws aren't prescribing that. It's at the discretion of the boiler operators if they want to go from a standard class to an advanced class. Boiler intermediate defaults to boiler standard. What is the process for upgrading to boiler advanced when superheaters and economizers are operated by a license? So I'll answer that one again. So the work health and safety regulations recognise that there are some differences between the existing boilers. So if you are able to operate a boiler under your intermediate class, the work health and safety regulations are structured so that you can continue to operate that boiler using that class. However, if you are a new operator coming into and obtaining a standard boiler class, you will only be able to operate the existing standard boiler. So there is a transition period there, and if you're operating an intermediate boiler with the superheater and economizer options, you'll be able to continue to do that, but only if you're doing that now. Regulation 141A, RTOs keep records for 5 years. Specifically, what records do they need to keep? ASC only requires RTOs to keep training and assessment for 6 months. Okay, so I'm not sure of the exact wording of Regulation 141A, but the records are kept to ensure that DEMIRS can conduct its audits. So it'll be the various documentation you have, obviously the assessment instruments, completed assessment instruments, and NOAAs and those documentations. So there's no change to the documents between those required for occupational safety and health and those required under the work health and safety laws. The next question, if intermediate boiler operator licence holders are granted a standard boiler operator licence, how long do they have to upgrade to? That's the same question. Do you need to have a classified itinerant plant record book, and are there any changes to these books? Red books, Eric.
Thank you, Bill. So there will be no specific requirement to maintain the previous classified record book that you are keeping under the mine safety inspection regulations. However, there are a number of regulations that specify the level of records that you do need to keep. So you will still need to keep evidence of inspections, you'll need to keep evidence of any failures and repairs and maintenance done, you'll need to keep all the registration documentation on hand, and all of these need to be readily available for the life of the plant. though you may not have to explicitly maintain the book in the same, like a physical book, like you had to do in the past, you still need to ensure that all of the records that you're keeping in the book are available.
Will high-risk work licenses still be valid for 5 years from obtainment? Lucy.
Yes, they will be, and there will be that 12-month grace period for renewal.
What are the transition periods for all that was mentioned today? Will the period time be similar? Okay, so the work health and safety laws are structured so that when they commence, your existing authorisation, so all of your high-risk work licences and plant registrations, asbestos and demolition licences, you will automatically come across. So you won't need to do anything. And as Zarina mentioned, the department will be providing for intermediate and basic boiler operators a new card once the work health and safety laws commence, and that will be dispatched as soon as possible. So the next question: do subcontractors that only hire plant need to do any registrations? Eric.
If you're a subcontractor hiring out plant, it should be noted that the regulation says that any person with management or control of the plant is able to perform a registration. You are not allowed to operate plant that hasn't been registered that requires registration. So if you're a subcontractor that has hired this plant, if it doesn't have registration, you will not be able to operate it. So it will probably be in the interest of the organisation hiring it to you or letting it to you to register it, but you will not be able to operate it if it isn't registered, but you can register it yourself if you're a person with management control of it.
Eric. The next question: will boiler plant be required to be reclassified for licensing if they were classified as boiler intermediate originally? Okay, so there's two issues here. The first one is that the boiler plant is not classified as such. It's the boiler operator that's classified. So if you are a boiler intermediate and a boiler basic, you'll become a standard boiler. You'll have a standard boiler class, and with that class, that determines what type or what classification of plant you can operate. So you can only operate the plant for which you have been approved. Next question: can you please clarify what you mean by new class? Lucy.
Yes, so by a new class, it means a class of authorization that's not currently regulated under the OSH regs.
Okay, so that's your reach stackers and...
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, good. Will rules for registration of high-risk work licence assessors be published to understand how the process for reach stacker, as assessors don't even hold the high-risk work licence now?
I can answer that. So in terms of the rules, I guess there are a lot of documentation, applicant guidelines, things that are particularly relevant to obtaining a license that will be not just published on our website, but also relayed to applicants when they contact the Department of WorkSafe Licensing. So specifically with the process for reach stackers, we're aware that obviously at the moment, you don't need a license in WA to operate a reach stacker. And so there are a lot of arrangements or policy matters that still need to be determined. But once it is, that information will be provided to the public to give them a better understanding of what that process looks like.
Okay, the next question then is, can you tell us any differences between the existing forklift licensing requirements and those required under the high-risk work licence for work health and safety regulations? So the answer to that is that the forklift is basically the same. However, the definition of work health of the forklift has been varied. So the existing definition under the occupational safety and health laws refers to an elevating load carriage and a pair of fork arms. For the work health and safety regulation, the definition has been amended, and it refers to elevating load carriage, pair of fork arms or other arms. And what that means is that the traditional forklift we have, where there's a set of tines, requires a higher risk work license. Probably the best example I can provide is that if a forklift has a bar on it, which might be used to carry carpets under the existing occupational safety and health laws, because of the reference to pair of fork arms, a high risk work license is not required. Under the work health and safety laws, because of the reference to other arms, a forklift license will be required. So the requirements have been expanded, and if there are any other attachments which have other arms, in those circumstances, a high risk work license will also be required. The other thing that the forklift does is that it introduces a 900mm threshold in the work health and safety definition. So if your forklift is not able to rise more than 900mm, a high risk work license is not required. The logical question we get from there is, why is it so? And the answer is, it's for consistency with the other jurisdictions. We're not quite sure where the 900mm came from, but that means that Western Australian high risk work licenses in relation to forklifts are consistent with other jurisdictions. So the next question, will rules for registration, high risk work license assessor, be published to understand the process? We've already done that. Is there a requirement to retain an historical record of those found NYC in the workplace? Anybody know what NYC means? Even if they've okay. Is there a Thank you. Is there a requirement to maintain an historical record of those found not yet competent in the workplace, even if they have subsequently achieved competence? I'd have to check, but I think logically speaking, what we're concerned about is the assessment to provide to complete the completing the assessment in order for the statement of attainment to be delivered. So I'm not sure what you do at present. I will have a check back at work with the auditor just to see, and we'll provide some information on that. It's better to be safe than sorry. So if you have that question, if you can provide your details to us, we'll try and get an answer back to you. But I suspect really what we're concerned about is the work health and safety law, is the assessment, and the basis for providing the assessment that the person is competent. The next question. Tourist type operators do not appear to hold the appropriate certificate of competency in regards to drivers and firemen. Can this be clarified, please? Eric.
Given the language that's used, I assume the question is about operators of steam locomotives. So steam locomotives that are provided for a commercial service are not part of the normal WorkSafe jurisdiction, and they will not be covered by this legislation. Ones who are currently operating as a volunteer organisation are also not covered under the current legislation, however, they will be in the future. If you're talking about other operators, so like miniature trains or stationary steam engines and things like that, volunteers will be picked up under the new legislation, and we will be working with those organisations to work towards the appropriate levels of competence.
Thanks, Eric. The next question. Are telehandlers classified as forklifts in the new regulations? Serena.
No. So telehandlers or multi-tool carriers don't require a high-risk work license unless the way that you have fitted it results in the requirement of a high-risk work license. So with forklifts, you will only need a high-risk work license if there is a mast.
As an RTO in the Indian Ocean Territories, hiring plant to deliver high-risk work training and assessment, will the local companies on Christmas and Cocos Island be made aware? Eric.
Christmas and Cocos Islands will be visited by specific plant inspectors in the near future, and information sessions will be provided.
Next question, presumably for you, Zarina. Will a Manitou be classified differently like an HRWL?
I'm assuming that when you say a Manitou, you're referring to the model of a forklift.
Okay, so I think a Manitou is a multi-purpose tool carrier, and the answer is exactly the same as currently operates, and that is if the multi-purpose tool carrier is configured so it meets the definition of a high-risk work license, you must obtain a high-risk work license to do that work. If it doesn't meet the definition in the high-risk work license in the work health and safety laws, a license is not required. If we haven't answered your question correctly, or if there's something else you want clarified, by all means, send through another question and we'll see if we can answer it for you. The next question, is there any appetite to have explicit timeframes for high-risk work licence courses as per New South Wales to prevent RTOs running courses that are clearly inadequate? So at this stage, there is no intention that I'm aware of anyway in relation to timeframes. If you believe that RTOs are running courses that are inadequate, the appropriate regulator is the Australian Skills Quality Authority, ASQA, or the training accreditation. So if you take those details to those organisations, if you have those concerns, they will be able to investigate your concerns for you. Eric.
Probably just a comment on RTOs running courses that are clearly inadequate. If you are an RTO or you are otherwise an assessor or a trainer, I recommend that you familiarise yourself with Section 26A of the WHS Regulations 2020, which places a specific duty on you to ensure that the training that you provide is adequate and fit for purpose. And if it isn't, you can be liable if it causes death for penalties up to and including imprisonment. That is a motivator, and that is our difference from the other states at the moment.
Thanks, Eric. The next question. Some design standards listed in OSH Schedule 4.3 are now superseded, i.e. ASNZ 1200-2000 for pressure equipment. Will this be updated to the latest revision? Eric.
There will be no explicit requirement to comply with any specific standards in the new legislation. You will need to demonstrate an appropriate level of safety that meets your requirements and general duties according to the Act.
Thanks, Eric. The next question. Will assessments for multi-purpose tool carriers that require a CN be able to be completed using such, or will we continue to need to do training on different? If a multi-purpose tool carrier is a crane, is being used as a crane and meets the definition of CN, I'm not sure why you wouldn't be able to continue to use that for assessment purposes, because it's for intents and purposes for the high-risk work licenses, it's a CN. If you know something that we've missed, by all means send us the details and we'll see if we can answer it. But if a multi-purpose tool carrier is configured as a CN, well, that's the high-risk work license that you need, and I can't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to use that as the training item of plant in any event. So the next question, as a WorkSafe BI assessor, do I need extensive exposure training to upgrade my assessor's license to include BS training and assessment? So as the boilers are in a hierarchy, so boiler advanced means you can operate all of the lower licenses. BI means you can operate a BB, but there is a requirement, of course, overriding anything that might be provided in terms of a card for the PCBU and also the worker to make sure they are competent to operate the plant. The high-risk work licenses are a threshold qualification, but it still requires training and assessment and supervision to make sure that you can operate a particular item of plant. So if you're a BI assessor, you can still assess a standard high-risk work license process. Just bear with us a moment. What are the regulations around carrying out a lift with a telehandler using chains and slings? Thanks, Harry. Yes, so the work health and safety regulations are basically the same as the occupational safety and health regulations. So if you're using a telehandler under the occupational safety and health regulations, it's a crane, you're slinging loads, the occupational safety and health laws apply, and those laws, I don't think there are any changes under the work health and safety laws. You still have to do you still have to have the appropriate licenses. So the next question, do classified plant need to have registration of plant and other documents in the machine, for example, an elevated work platform? Eric.
It will no longer be a requirement to have plant registration displayed on or near the item of plant. However, it still needs to be readily accessible to anyone who may use the plant. So you may find that it's easier to still have it on the machine so that any operators can check that it is actually registered.
Under the new regulations, what will be the frequency of mandatory inspections for boiler and pressure vessels? Eric.
There will be no mandated inspection frequency for boilers and pressure vessels.
So I think they have to comply with the manufacturer's instructions. Do interstate persons holding an HRW or a high-risk work licence need to swap to a Western Australian high-risk work licence? And if so, how long before this change is needed? So I think on renewal, Lucy and Zarina might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think on renewal there is a requirement. In fact, no, it's not. I'm not sure. So I think your main problem is going to be if you're in the eastern states, when you go to renew your high-risk work licence, there is a residential requirement. Western Australia doesn't have that residential requirement. But I would say that, as I say, if you want to renew your high-risk work licence and you're from the eastern states, one of the eastern states jurisdictions, they have residential requirements. And if you're living in Western Australia, they will be saying to you that you need to obtain a high-risk work licence from Western Australia. And as Lucy, I think, talked about, it was quite an easy change to transfer to a Western Australian high-risk work licence. So it's 12:45. I have one more question. So if you have any others outstanding, please get those in before the time expires. The question is, will DEMIRS provide guidance? High-risk work licences are only entry-level competencies and do not include industry experiences, dogging. Okay. So in terms of high-risk work licences, the department, we often get asked this question, and it is a consistent answer. So in terms of high-risk work licences, the duty is on the workplace to ensure, particularly in relation to that duty is with the employer, to make sure people are trained, have adequate supervision. It's within their general duty. So that is, it should be generally known. And if not, as I say, I'm confirming now that you will need to be trained for the particular item of plant that you may be working on. And just putting plant aside, when you think about it, it's a general duty in any way, in any event, irrespective of a high-risk work licence, that people are provided with appropriate training, supervision to make sure that they can do the work safely in the workplace. I guess I've mentioned the duty a couple of times on the PCBU or the employer. It's also important to know that the work health and safety regulations place duties on workers as well to make sure that they operate safely. So they must take reasonable care of themselves at workplace. care of others who might be at the workplace. They must also comply with reasonable instructions and reasonable policies. So those are prescribed quite clearly in the Work Health and Safety Act, but it's certainly something that under the Occupational Safety and Health Act is required in any event. Will the plant registrations be publicly available? So when hiring, you can perform due diligence before the plant is mobilised to your worksite. Eric?
No. I would recommend that when you are hiring plant, you ask for evidence of plant registration.
This is good. We've had a couple of extra questions come through. Will there be a document made available breaking down what was discussed today? The department will be publishing its webinars on the website as soon as possible. I'm not sure when this one will be available. There's a process we have to go through, but hopefully by the end of next week, it will be available for review on the DMIRS website. Next question. Will DMIRS audit very safe VOC systems as promoted by CME and others to ensure it meets industry standards for high-risk work licence as it promotes? Okay, so the very safe is obviously for mines. It's not something that's regulated in the Work Health and Safety regulations. There's no particular prescription in relation to very safe. It's used by the CME members, presumably, as a means for assisting in the verification of competencies. That is a duty for the PCBU or the employer to make sure their workers are safe. So no, DMIRS won't be auditing the very safe system. That's a matter for the CME. Next question. Can you please talk a little more about the new class relating to a standard boiler? What is the new addition? I have some. Okay. So all that's happening is that in relation to boilers, as Lucy and Zareni have pointed out, we go from 3 boiler classes, and that is boiler advanced, boiler intermediate, and boiler basic. Under the Work Health and Safety, there is only a boiler advanced class and a boiler standard class. If you hold the current boiler basic and the boiler intermediate, you'll automatically be converted to a boiler standard class. So that's what we mean. So it's really converting 2 classes to 3. There's no fundamental change to the advanced class, but the intermediate and basic become a boiler standard class. So can you tell us about the residential requirements for issuing high-risk work licenses? In the model work health and safety laws, there is reference to a residential requirement before Western Australia can issue a high-risk work licence. In Western Australia, the government has decided that rather than a residential requirement, the requirement will be that the assessments are conducted in Western Australia. Basically, the reasoning for this is that we have a lot of eastern state workers who come to Western Australia, particularly for the mining industry, and they, of course, undertake various courses while they are at work. They would not be able to obtain a licence if Western Australia followed the same system as the other jurisdictions, and this provides the flexibility for the regulator to issue a high-risk work licence, providing the assessments are conducted in Western Australia and conducted by a Western Australian registered assessor. Another question, can you please, no, that's the lot, I think, of all our questions. More popping up, okay. So, do we have some more, or is they're the same ones? Oh, okay, here we are. Please explain how it will work for non-boom type concrete placing pumps. Eric.
I presume you're asking around the design and plant registration requirements. Non-boom type pumps still do not require design registration or plant registration. The only ones that do are both stationary and mobile boom type pumps.
And if you're referring to your high-risk work licenses, you need to go back to the definition of concrete placing booms. My recollection is that there's a reference to booms. So if you meet the definition of for high-risk work license purposes, you will require a high-risk work license. Will verification of competency still be needed for operating equipment at mine sites such as for EWPs, cranes, and excavators? If you are operating an item of plant that requires a high-risk work license, that's your threshold. As I've mentioned previously, it is up to the mine operators, the PCBU if you like, to make sure that operators have the necessary experience to operate EWPs and cranes and also excavators. Presumably in relation to EWPs and cranes, you're talking about the high-risk work licenses. Unless excavators are used for cranes, as a crane, they don't require a high-risk work license. But the PCBU must make sure that you are competent, even though you have a high-risk work license or in addition to a high-risk work license, to operate a particular item of plant such as an EWP, crane or excavator. And also the worker has to make sure that they're happy as well, taking reasonable care to look after themselves. Please explain what changes to registered plant need to be notified. A lot of bridge cranes are transitioning to remote control. Do we need to notify demurs? Eric.
As a general rule of thumb, any alterations to the design of a registrable item of plant or design registrable item of plant that impact its safety in any way, which would include changing to a remote control from a pendant or from local control, do require an alteration to design. So yes, you would need to register an alteration to design if you made that change.
Almost all boiler intermediate operators will be operating boiler advanced class boilers under the new definition. Why default to the lower class? The work health and safety laws are modelled on they are based on the model work health and safety laws, and this is consistent with the other jurisdictions. In relation to new high-risk work license, people doing advanced high-risk work licenses, they will need to do the new course. Similarly, there'll be a new course for the intermediate, for the standard class as well. Now, if you've been involved with boilers for any length of time, you'll be aware that the existing assessment instruments and units of competency for Western Australia will be a long way behind the other jurisdictions. So this now brings us into a situation where we are consistent with the other jurisdictions, and it means that Western Australian operators will be able to go to the eastern states. If you are a Western Australian operator and you currently operate some of those superheaters, etc., you won't be able to operate those items of plant in the eastern states. You'll have to comply with the standard boiler requirements. If you want to operate the superheaters, etc., you'll need to obtain an advanced license if you want to go to the eastern states. So this is along the similar lines. If I have a BI that changes to a BS, so a boiler intermediate that changes to a boiler standard for boiler with superheater, does the new person need BA? Can I train them, or do I need an upgrade? So I'm not sure. Okay, so the way I interpret this is that if you are an assessor and you are and you have an intermediate class and you want to train to an advanced class, you will need to obtain an advanced class to do that training. So unless you have an advanced accreditation as an assessor, you will not be able to train an advanced operator. So we have 5 minutes to go. As it's turned out, questions have kept coming in. And here's another one. Where companies have modified classified plant, disable functions such as emission controls, such as AdBlue, will WorkSafe be okay with this, Eric?
WorkSafe don't explicitly approve any element of a change of design. However, if you have changed the design, you still need to get it verified by an appropriate design verifier if it has an impact on the safety of the item of plant. With changing it for emission controls for AdBlue, whether or not it's a safety impacting system will depend on if it's being used underground, whether it's being used above ground, whether people are going to be exposed to the emissions and things like that. All of these need to be taken into account when you make the change, because presumably you're going to do a risk assessment. And if it does have any change on the safety of the item of plant, then it needs to be re-registered. It needs to have an alteration of design submitted.
It's probably also worth noting you've mentioned classified plant. Classified plant is a term that's used in the mine safety inspection regulations, and it's not something that is referenced in the work health and safety regulations. The alternative terms are registrable plant design and item registration. If you have a look across at the two different groups, so classified as opposed to the work health and safety, you'll find that the work health and safety list of classified plant, the work health and safety list of registrable plant is larger than the classified plant in the mine safety inspection regulations. I think it's smaller, in fact. But anyway, check to make sure that it's still required. So do a check across from the classified plant to the registrable plant in the work health and safety laws. Okay, so I think that's the end of our presentation. We've answered all of the issues for you. If you have any outstanding issues, by all means, you can check on the webinar later on this week, and you'll find the general webinars that we've been doing on the work health and safety laws. I think there's going to be a mines one there. If it's not already, that will also be available very soon. And I expect that we will be providing this on the website in the not too distant future. And if you have any inquiries or any issues that you want to raise in relation to asbestos and demolition licensing, 4th of February is the time, and I think Lucy and Zareen are with us again to do that session. So that's on the 4th, and it'll follow a similar format. So thank you again for joining us, and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any inquiries. Thank you.